This is Mr. Oscar, and today we will talk about something that was operating in my life for years before I ever had a name for it. Not a mindset problem, not a motivation problem, not a character flaw or a discipline deficit or any of the other stories I used to tell myself when I couldn't understand why I kept producing the same results no matter how hard I tried to think my way into a different outcome. I'm talking about your environment, the physical space you work in, the people who surround you daily, the objects on your desk, the layout of your home, the route you take to work, the chair you sit in when you open your laptop, the notifications on your phone, the conversations you walk into every morning before you have even had a chance to decide who you are going to be that day, all of it, quietly shaping your behavior, continuously, without asking your permission. And here is what most people never fully grasp. You are not failing because you lack willpower. You are failing because you are placing a person with ordinary human willpower inside an environment that was never designed to support the behavior you are asking of yourself, and then blaming the person. A psychologist named Lewin understood this long before the modern productivity world ever started selling you apps and morning routines. His work, built nearly a century ago, laid the foundation for everything behavioral science now knows about why humans do what they do in the spaces they inhabit. And once you understand his core insight, you will never look at your surroundings the same way again. I want to take you back to the year I thought I had finally cracked it. It was 2013. I had rebuilt enough of my life after the business collapse to start working again seriously. I had a new home office. I had a clear vision of what I wanted to build. I had read enough at that point about habits, systems, and psychology to feel genuinely equipped. I was not the same man who had watched his business fall apart 2 years earlier. I had done the inner work. I was ready. And for about 3 weeks, I was on fire. I was executing. I was focused. I was finishing things. I went to bed at night with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had finally figured himself out. And then, slowly, without any single dramatic moment, the wheels came off again. Not all at once, the same way they always had, gradually. A distracted morning here, a lost afternoon there, plans that got pushed, focus that fractured. By week 6, I was back in the same fog I thought I had left behind permanently. I was devastated, because I had done everything right internally, the mindset work, the goal setting, the intention building. I had followed every piece of advice I had consumed, and it had lasted less than 2 months. I remember sitting at my desk one afternoon, a desk that had slowly accumulated weeks of papers, old coffee cups, notebooks open to plans I hadn't executed, bills I hadn't filed, and just staring at it. Not working, just staring. And something occurred to me that I had never consciously noticed before. Every single day I sat down at that desk, I was sitting down inside the physical evidence of my own incomplete execution. Every unfinished thing, every delayed decision, every piece of paper representing something I hadn't dealt with. It was all right there, surrounding me, before I had typed a single word or made a single decision. I was starting every working day already inside an environment that whispered failure at me before I had even begun. I didn't have the language for what I was experiencing, but I felt it. And it sent me looking for answers in a direction I had never looked before. Not inward, but outward. Not at my psychology in isolation, but at the relationship between my psychology and the space I was operating in. That search eventually led me to the work of Lewin, and it reframed everything. Lewin was a German-American psychologist who worked in the early to mid-20th century and is widely regarded as one of the founding fathers of modern social psychology. His influence is so foundational that many of the behavioral principles we now take for granted, from organizational management to habit science to environmental design, trace their roots directly back to his thinking. The insight I want to focus on today comes from what Lewin called his field theory. Lewin proposed that human behavior is not simply a product of who a person is, it is a product of the interaction between the person and their environment. He expressed this in a formula that looks simple but carries enormous implications. Behavior equals the function of the person and their environment. What Lewin was saying, and what decades of subsequent research has confirmed, is that you cannot understand or predict how a person will behave by looking only at their internal qualities, their intentions, their values, their desire, their discipline. You must also look at the field they are operating in, the total psychological environment surrounding them, because that environment is not a passive backdrop, it is an active force. It is constantly pushing and pulling behavior in specific directions, towards certain actions and away from others. Lewin called these forces within the environment vectors. Some vectors are driving forces, they push behavior toward a goal. Others are restraining forces, they push behavior away from it. And his research showed that at any given moment, a person's behavior is largely determined by the balance of those forces in their environment, not by the strength of their internal resolve. This is a radical reframe if you sit with it properly. Because what it means is that placing a highly motivated person inside an environment loaded with restraining forces will eventually produce the same result as placing an unmotivated person there. The environment wins, not always, not instantly. But over time, with the grinding cumulative pressure of friction, distraction, and misaligned cues, the environment wins. And conversely, designing an environment with strong driving forces and minimal restraining forces will support execution even on the days when internal motivation is low. This is what Lewin called force field analysis, and the practical application of it to personal execution is something that behavioral scientists have been building on ever since. B.J. Fogg at Stanford, whose work on behavioral design I've referenced before on this channel, demonstrated through his research on what he calls motivation waves that human motivation is inherently unstable. It rises and falls. It is influenced by sleep, stress, hormones, social interaction, the news cycle, 1,000 variables outside your control. Fogg's conclusion is the same conclusion Lewin pointed toward decades earlier. You cannot build a reliable execution system on the foundation of motivation alone. You must design the environment to carry the behavior when motivation is absent. Fogg's concept of friction is particularly important here. He found that the single most powerful predictor of whether a behavior happens is not how motivated a person is. It is how much friction stands between the person and the behavior. Reduce the friction and the behavior becomes dramatically more likely. Increase the friction and even highly motivated people stop doing it. Think about what that means for the way you have set up your life. If the thing you need to execute on every day requires you to first clear a cluttered workspace, find the right document buried in a disorganized folder, silence the notifications you forgot to turn off last night, resist the pull of the open social media tab in your browser, and fight through the ambient noise of an environment that was never designed for focus, you are starting every single execution attempt already depleted, already behind, already fighting the environment instead of being carried by it. Wendy Wood at the University of Southern California, whose research on habit formation I have also discussed before, found in her studies that context, the physical and social cues present in your environment, is the most powerful trigger for habitual behavior, more powerful than intention, more powerful than motivation. When your environment contains strong cues linked to a specific behavior, that behavior becomes almost automatic. When the cues are absent or replaced by competing cues, even well-intentioned behavior breaks down. Wood studied people who had successfully changed long-term habits and found a consistent pattern. The most successful behavior changes almost always coincided with a significant change in environment, moving to a new city, starting a new job, redesigning a workspace. Not because the person had changed internally, but because the new environment had stripped away the old behavioral cues and created space for new ones to form. She calls this a habit discontinuity. And the implication is profound. If you want to change your behavior without changing your environment, you are working against one of the most powerful forces in behavioral science. You are asking your intentions to overpower a system of cues and triggers that has been conditioning your responses for months or years. There is also critical research here from Robert Cialdini, the psychologist and author of Influence, who spent decades studying the environmental and social forces that shape human decision-making. Cialdini found that people dramatically underestimate the degree to which their choices are driven by environmental cues rather than deliberate thought. He called this the focusing illusion, the tendency to believe our behavior is more internally driven than it actually is. His research showed that subtle environmental changes, the placement of objects, the visibility of certain choices, the social signals present in a space, reliably alter behavior in measurable ways without the person ever being consciously aware of the influence. In other words, your environment is making decisions for you, every day, in ways you are not fully tracking. The question Lewin asked nearly a century ago is the same question I want you to sit with today. Is your environment a weapon working for you or against you? Here is the practical work I want you to do this week, not a complete life redesign. 1 focused audit and 3 deliberate changes. The audit is simple. Sit in the space where you do your most important work, or where you are supposed to do it, and write down the answer to this question. What in this environment is making the behavior I need to execute harder than it needs to be? Be honest, be specific, not vague complaints. Concrete friction points. The phone that is always within arm's reach. The desk that faces a window with too much movement outside. The workspace that doubles as a storage space so your brain never fully shifts into execution mode when you enter it. The open email tab. The chair that is comfortable enough to fall asleep in but not alert enough to work seriously from. Write the friction points down, all of them. Now make 3 changes. Specifically using Lewin's force field framework, your goal is to reduce restraining forces and increase driving forces simultaneously. To reduce friction, remove one physical obstacle from your execution environment before tomorrow morning. Put the phone in another room during your most important work window. Clear the desk surface of everything that is not directly related to the task at hand. Close the browser tabs. Make the environment simpler, cleaner, and more singularly focused than it currently is. To increase driving forces, add one environmental cue that pulls you toward the behavior you need to execute. Fogg calls these cues anchors. Put the book you need to read on your pillow the night before, so it is the first thing you see in the morning. Place the notebook open on your desk before you go to sleep, so the blank page is waiting for you when you sit down. Set the single most important task you need to execute written on a physical piece of paper and placed directly in your line of sight before anything else enters your field of vision. And the third change, remove one social restraining force from your daily execution window. Lewin's field theory was not only about physical environment, it was about the full psychological field, including the people in it. If there is a recurring conversation, a habitual social media check, a relationship dynamic that consistently pulls you out of execution mode during your most important hours, that is a restraining force. Name it. Then build a boundary around your execution time that protects it from that force. Not forever, not harshly, just during the hours that matter most. 3 changes, built on Lewin's framework, measurable from day one. I want to close with something that shifted the way I think about personal responsibility. For a long time, I believed that the answer to my execution failures was inside me, that if I could just become stronger, more disciplined, more mentally tough, the environment wouldn't matter. I would override it through character alone. That belief kept me stuck for years, because it placed the entire burden of execution on a resource, willpower, that behavioral science has proven repeatedly to be finite, unreliable, and deeply vulnerable to the conditions around it. Kurt Lewin did not say the person doesn't matter. He said the person and the environment are inseparable. You cannot engineer better behavior while ignoring the field you are operating in. It is not weakness to acknowledge that your environment shapes you. It is intelligence. The most effective executors I have ever studied or known personally are not the ones with the most willpower. They are the ones who stopped fighting their environment and started designing it. Your environment is a weapon. The only question is who it is currently pointed at. Aim it in the right direction, and watch what becomes possible. I'm Mr. Oscar. This is Execution Psychology, and I will see you in the next one.